The incoming Trump administration is planning to scrap an Obama-era policy that prevented ICE agents from arresting undocumented immigrants in so-called sensitive locations without approval from supervisors. The policy was created in 2011, has remained through Biden's current term. It bans arrests in hospitals, schools, at funerals, houses of worship, among others. Three sources familiar with the plan tell NBC News Trump intends to rescind that policy as soon as his first day in office, adding the incoming administration believes it will allow ICE to more efficiently implement Trump's mass deportation plan. Joining us now, one of the journalists who broke the story, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, good morning. I want to talk exactly about the plans the Trump administration has, but a little more on this policy to begin with. Probably makes sense to a lot of people not to go into a hospital or a funeral, for example, to grab somebody and deport them. Why was it put in place to begin with?
Yeah, when this was put in place in 2011 by Obama's then ICE director, John Morton, it seemed like common sense. They wanted to allow migrants to be able to get services that they needed to be able to prosper and live in a community peacefully. Undocumented children are still allowed to go to school even if their parents are in this country undocumented. The idea that parents could be arrested picking up their children from school, or that they would be discouraged from going into that setting, from getting emergency health care, from attending a wedding or a funeral, these all seemed like common sense places to protect. And in fact, the first Trump administration stood by this. They did not change these rules when they came into office. The Biden administration went further to define exactly what these places were. They also said it includes rallies. So if you think about it, when they rescind this policy, Willie, if there are protests against mass deportations and undocumented immigrants show up there, ICE could now target those locations to do arrest. And what advocates say is that this will send more people underground. That means migrants will be afraid to come out and participate in their communities. It could affect how they live, how their children are able to live in a healthy way, and it could affect how they interact with police. So if they're victims of crimes, they could be disincentivized from going to places where they could talk and actually be cooperative with law enforcement.
You know, Julie, as you know, covering this beat so closely, Tom Homan, who's the border czar, that's the title they're using, has said repeatedly, we're going after the bad guys. So that opens the question of where do you draw the line of who's a bad guy and who's not? Is it a convicted criminal? Is it a suspected criminal? How do you see this policy of mass deportation actually being implemented?
Yeah, Willie, that's interesting, because what Homan is saying is we're going after the bad guys. But everything we've reported here so far indicates that they want to get these numbers as high as possible. The very idea that they're going to rescind this policy, it isn't really thought of that the bad guys are at churches and weddings and funerals and hospitals and schools, but rather if they rescind this, they can get the numbers higher. It's also the reason why they're looking at major metropolitan areas and talking to private prison companies to vastly expand ICE detention. They're looking at the cost of what it could be to deport millions. Look at that figure, 9.9 billion over a decade. We understand that this $88 billion figure that we heard in the first year is actually far lower than what they would need to do. They need to ramp up planes. The numbers they're looking at really go beyond just going after criminals. We should point out ICE has a really hard time tracking down those criminals. There are over 400,000 migrants in this country who have been convicted of crimes that are not detained by ICE. But that number is very similar to what they saw at the end of the first Trump administration. ICE has notoriously had a hard time finding migrants, especially when it's found out later that they were convicted of crimes in their home countries before they cross the border, if that information wasn't known at the time. And so it's difficult to see how they're going to be able to focus just on the bad guys and really get them all out.
Hey, Julia, explain to people watching, why does it cost so much money to deport migrants?
Well, it comes down to the bed space. As you know, they have these contracts, expensive contracts with private prison companies. They have to be able to monitor them as they go through the asylum process. If they do have a claim, you have to be able to put them on a plane, send them back. Also, in cases of countries that are unwilling to take back their migrants, you have to be able to force them possibly to another country. We reported last week they're coming up with a list of other countries that don't want to take them back. What will be their financial incentive motive or incentive at all to take back migrants who aren't from those countries. And overall costs really go up when you look at the fact, again, that they don't know where a lot of these migrants are. I've been with ICE on ride-alongs. It can take about 8 agents just to make one arrest sometimes.
Wow.
And they have 8 million migrants on the non-detained docket, and they only have about 1,000 ICE agents who are out doing those fugitive operations. The numbers there just don't really lend themselves to being able to make these mass arrests, particularly when they're going after people who could be a high threat to the agents or to the public.
We've had a back and forth. We've heard a back and forth, Julia, between Donald Trump and the president of Mexico, the new president of Mexico. I'm curious, is Mexico changing its policy in any way that is more in line with what Donald Trump wants to maybe stop the flow through Mexico into the United States?
We do understand there have been about 2 calls between Claudia Sheinbaum and Trump, and in those calls that she has not made any promises to that extent. We know that she does not want this 25% tariff that Trump has been hanging over Mexico. He's really taking the stick over the carrot approach to get Mexico to comply. I think the thing that Sheinbaum and the previous Mexican administration really tried to point out is that they have already done so much for the United States when it comes to stopping immigration. They have tripled their interdictions in the last year. It's one of the reasons why the numbers at our border have come down so far. They're already taking back 30,000 people per month from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that show up at our border. They can take those people back, all through agreements the Biden administration worked out with them. And then, of course, they did remain in Mexico during the first Trump administration, something they don't want to see come back again. So I think in all of these conversations, Mexico is not ready to go head-to-head with Trump and say, no, here's our red line. Obviously, they know they need to keep that as an open dialogue and a good relationship with the United States. And I think they're worried about those tariffs, but they also keep wanting to remind their public and the American public how much Mexico has taken on already on this issue. Meanwhile, they're really worried and they want more from the United States to keep arms trafficking from going into Mexico. And of course, both countries are worried about the spread of fentanyl.
All right, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, thank you for your great reporting. We appreciate it.